Hello and welcome. I'm Vikram, Chandra, and you're watching This World on WION World is One. Well, I have to say that this world is anything but united as we speak. All kinds of wars seem to be fought around us. Between short sellers and businessmen, between countries and their people, between two countries which are neighbors, and then of course there's the eternal war that parents have been fighting since time immemorial, the war to keep their children safe. We will cover all four of these topics and more on the show tonight. But let's start by taking a look at the stories that have made headlines around the world in the past 7 days. India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the country's union budget for 2023 on the 1st of February. Sitharaman announced major changes in the tax slabs for personal taxation and also hiked the allocation for infrastructure across the board, especially the railways, and also boosting capital expenditure to try and kickstart growth. Russia claims to have captured a village in the northern outskirts of Bakhmut. The village of Blahodate is 5 kilometers from Bakhmut. Russia says it was captured with the help of aerial support. This week marked 2 years of the military coup in Myanmar. Pro-democracy activists held a silent demonstration across the country as the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada and Australia announced fresh sanctions against the junta-linked firms. The United States has secured access to 4 military bases in the Philippines amidst concerns over China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea. It helps create an arc of American allies all the way from Japan way down towards Australia. Airbus and Qatar Airways have reached a settlement in a long-standing legal dispute over the safety of the A350. In December 2021, Qatar had announced it was suing Airbus over what it described as the, quote, accelerated surface degradation, unquote, of the A350 jets. Gautam Adani. That's one name we bet you've heard more than any other this week. Gautam Adani was till a week ago the richest man in India, also the richest in Asia. At one point, not too long back, Adani was even the second richest person in the world. But as we speak, he's been struggling with an unprecedented crisis. While Adani's businesses have lost more than $100 billion in barely a week, Adani himself has lost around, $57 billion in personal wealth, dropping out of the top 20 list in the richest people in the world. Also, his group is facing one of the biggest stock market sell-offs in the history of India. I don't think this sort of a drop in just a week has been seen in a long, long time, if ever. Now, the obvious question that many of you have been asking is, how did all of this happen? What is the fine print? What lay behind all of this? And we'll try and explain some of that to you. Essentially, it's a David and Goliath story. The story of a little-known firm taking on one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. This firm has accused Adani of market manipulation. Its name is Hindenburg Research. Hindenburg, well, it's a small New York-based research and trading firm founded by a rather well-known by now short seller named Nathan Anderson. Neither the man nor his company has been particularly well known until recently, except when they started coming out and taking down a large number of companies. Nikola was one of its most recent scalps. Now, before I go any further, I think I should tell you what exactly is short selling. But normally, you buy shares in a company hoping that it's going to go up. A short seller sells shares or bonds in the hope that their prices will go down. There are all sorts of technicalities in how this can actually be done, which I'm not going to weary you with right now. So the long and the short of it is that Hindenburg Research took short positions on the Adani Group, or to be more specific, short positions in some of the bonds of the Adani Group, betting that their prices will essentially go down. And then, on the 25th of January, Hindenburg Research published a 100-page report. It accused Adani of, quote, pulling the largest con in corporate history, unquote. The report said, quote, Adani used a web of offshore shell companies in tax havens to inflate revenue and stock prices, even as debt kept piling up. All of that basically meant that the Hindenburg Research was saying that the Adani Group was not worth what it was, and it was also saying that there were several irregularities. Was Hindenburg correct? Well, absolutely not, said the Adani Group, coming out with its own 413-page rebuttal and saying that all of this was nothing but an attack on India. "Don't wrap yourself in the national flag by looting the country," replied Hindenburg, and the story continued. So who's right in all of this? Well, obviously, these are matters that will be eventually decided by regulators and market authorities and perhaps even the courts if there is a libel action and somebody sues Hindenburg. But in the short term, if the intent of Hindenburg was to profit from a drop in the value of Adani companies, then boy, did they rake in and did they cash in, because down went the value of the Adani Group after the publication of that report, and in a dramatic fashion. Between the 25th of January and now, Adani Group shares have fallen like a pack of cards, a pile of rocks, call it what you will. This is an unprecedented collapse. This is the Adani Group's website. It says the Adani Group has businesses across sectors. In which areas? Well, just about everything. Energy and utilities in particular, but also transportation, logistics, defense is there, incubation is there, airports, materials, hydrogen, green hydrogen, among others. There are a large number of sectors that the Adani Group is in, virtually every sector if you really care to think about it. Now let's look at the companies, which include some of the recently acquired companies, cement giants like ACC and Gujarat Ambuja Cements, and of course the media company NDTV. When you look at the major companies, first there's the flagship Adani Enterprises, which has been at the center of all of these headlines in the last 1 week because of that FPO, which was subsequently called off. Adani Enterprises deals with natural resources, with defense, with aerospace, even airports. It incubates many of the Adani Group's companies. The Adani Group, under the banner Adani Airports, for example, has won the mandate to modernize and operate at least 6 Indian airports. You then have Adani Ports in SEZ Limited. SEZ stands for Special Economic Zones. This company manages ports, terminals and logistics. Then there's Adani Green Energy Limited, which claims to be the global #1 solar power generation asset owner. There's Adani Total Gas Limited, which sells PNG or piped natural gas to commercial and residential establishments. Also CNG or compressed natural gas to India's transport sector. And then there's Adani Transmission Limited, and there's Adani Power Limited. Basically, you get the general idea. This group has a vast range of interests. There's another company that deals with cooking oil. They are now listed companies, 2 of them, as I said, in cement and NDTV in the media. Real estate is also somewhere in there. Now, all of these companies are listed. They are public. Adani Enterprises were the first to be publicly listed. Others followed, with Adani Wilmar being the latest edition. Its IPO was in January 2022. Essentially, one of the very important things to be noted is that because these companies are listed and they are public, they are subject to public scrutiny and also the scrutiny of regulators such as SEBI. However, one of the things that needs to be noted also is that their ownership or their public float is somewhat small. Not too many of their shares are owned by either the public or by mutual funds, and that is one of the things that Hindenburg research has been pointing to. Having a very small float can mean that the prices can rise very fast. It can also mean, as we've been seeing in the last 1 week, prices can drop very fast. That's one of the important things to keep in mind as you discuss the Adani Group. What is the free float of many of their companies? Now, as Adani supporters have been saying, whatever you may say about stock gyrations up and down, there are many companies in there and many of them are solid businesses. There's annuity income in sectors like infrastructure. Even Hindenburg in its report didn't exactly argue with the fact that many of these businesses may have some value in them or they're doing solid businesses. The essential Hindenburg question was on valuation, and in particular the meteoric rise of Adani Group shares in the last 2 to 3 years, and whether that small float had a major impact in that. Let's just take a look at a couple of examples. This, for example, is Adani Enterprise. By November 2022, that is what had happened. Look at where the stock price was just 3, 4, 5 years ago, even a couple of years ago, and then it was 4,000 rupees, give or take, in November 2022. And this is a pattern that you will see in Adani share after Adani share. If you look at all of these companies, in the last 2 years, they have seen a massive rise in their prices. And then, after the Hindenburg research is out, that has all suddenly come crashing down. It's still not come all the way down to where the companies were just a couple of years ago. So let's remember that. Even after this carnage we've seen, most Adani Group companies are still substantially higher than where they were even in 2019 or 2020. Okay, so what does all of this mean for the Adani Group? What does it mean for India? What does it mean for the world? And what does it mean for Gautam Adani? Well, let's just start with the world part of it. By the way, there are some international repercussions that are already starting to be felt. We've just heard, for example, that Joe Johnson, the brother of Boris Johnson, has just quit as a director in a company that has some links with, it's been named in the Hindenburg research also, Elara Capital. There's been some talk about its exact association with Adani Group companies. Joe Johnson has just resigned from there. And that is just one of the many things that you could see in other parts of the world. When you have a crash like this or a major crisis like this, there's almost invariably going to be some international repercussions. But let's just come to some of the other questions we should be keeping in mind as we track the Adani saga over the next week, 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Question number one is around the value of the stocks. Now, quite frankly, the stock markets aren't necessarily the best judges of anything. You can have stock prices going up way more than they deserve. Then you can have stock prices falling again way below what they deserve. Stock market gyrations will be there. And the Adani Group essentially and the Hindenburg are going to be arguing a little bit only about stock valuations. Adani Group's been saying we are championing growth with goodness. Hindenburg says that the growth is all gas, essentially. Hindenburg has won round one when it comes to stock prices. Is it now going to book profits and move on? Or is there a longer battle ahead? So that's question one. Question two, what do the regulators make of all of this? And perhaps to the risk to other institutions in India, to banks that could be exposed, to the LIC and so on and so forth. That's why earlier this week, India's market regulator reportedly began probing this fall in shares. India's central bank decided to look into the exposure that Indian banks have to the Adani Group. Lenders to the Adani Group, by the way, include Punjab National Bank, IndusInd Bank, among many others. Question four. Will there be any contagion in terms of credit risk generally in India? Is there any risk to the Indian economy? Are people going to say, well, we are worried about the Adani Group? Like we've seen, for example, units of Credit Suisse Group or Citi have stopped taking certain Adani-linked collateral. Is that going to become a broader question around India? Most experts think it is really unlikely. But I think that is something that needs to be watched. Are other Indian companies going to be facing any problems because of whatever is happening in Adani? If you look at the stock market, by the way, nothing has happened to other Indian companies. It's largely been Adani Group companies only falling. It's not, there's been no contagion elsewhere. Question number five. What does this entire fracas mean for the actual businesses in the Adani Group? Are they going to continue to grow? Is there going to be a financial crisis? Is there going to be a real effect because of whatever's happening in the stock market? Now, Gautam Adani had to pull a stock sale worth $2.5 billion at the 11th hour. This was after the offer was fully subscribed. Here is what Gautam Adani himself has had to say about all of this.
After a fully subscribed FPO, yesterday's decision of his withdrawal would have surprised many. But considering the volatility of the market seen yesterday, our board strongly felt that it would not have been morally correct to proceed with the FPO. In my humble journey of over 4 decades as an entrepreneur, I have been blessed to receive overwhelming support from all stakeholders and particularly the investor community.
So let's put all of these questions now to Mark Matthews, who is the Managing Director of Julius Baer, joining us from Singapore. Welcome to the show, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, as somebody who runs Julius Baer, I'm sure it must be almost personally hurting you when somebody loses, what is it, 40 or 50 billion dollars of wealth in something like a week, which is what has happened to Gautam Adani.
It doesn't hurt me personally. It's not my money, but you're right, it's a lot of money.
What do you make of this entire thing? The sort of selling that we have seen in the last 1 week is massive. What is your take on the overall situation, Mark?
Well, on the one hand, I'm glad these sorts of short-selling research houses exist because they do write negative research, which the investment banks are usually very reluctant to do. But on the other hand, they can create sort of witch hunts and panic situations. And I think we're in a little bit like one of those now. The market has clearly panicked, and everything in India seems to be guilty until proven innocent. And I actually think that presents many opportunities. They seem to be being taken advantage of now. I'm looking at the price action. A lot of things are rebounding. So anyway, I think it'll prove to be a storm in a teacup longer term.
Mark, you seem to be saying you think it's going to be a storm in a teacup. So you think this is a temporary issue that has happened, and for Gautam Adani and the Adani Group, I'll come to India itself in a couple of minutes, but for the Adani Group, you're saying this is a storm in a teacup, and eventually the companies will do well and the stock market will recover and things will get back to normal. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's several different things. The stock market will do well, that I do know. As for the Adani Group, I personally think that the company is not going to disappear. It's got some very big and good quality assets. It's got good sponsors. It has cash. Yes, it has a lot of debt, but it also has cash.
Mark, I think if I can paraphrase what you're saying, and this is what many experts have also been saying to me in the last 3 or 4 days, there are some solid businesses in the Adani Group. They own a lot of assets, and as a result of that, you can't say that there is no value in there. The question, of course, is the valuation. Were they overvalued a week or 10 days ago or a year ago? Are they undervalued now? That's a question of price, which has to be determined at the stock market, and no one is completely clear as to what the correct valuation is, but there are some solid businesses in there. Is that what I heard you saying?
100%.
All right, you want to elaborate on that? Because this sort of price discovery can be quite painful, right? 50% down in a week.
Yes, and another problem is that the investment banks really don't cover these companies, very few of them. So it's hard to know really what the correct valuation should be. There's not a lot of research on these companies, and that does make the price discovery more difficult.
That actually is one of the things that was picked up by Hindenburg. They almost had it as a black mark against the group, saying, here you have a $150, $200 billion group, and why is there no research on it? Does that happen in your experience, that it can happen that sometimes a group can rise very fast and there's not much research on it?
Oh, yes. And the reason why is obvious. It's because the free float is small. And so there weren't a lot of institutions. Obviously, research is written for institutional investors. There weren't a lot of institutional investors who owned it or who own it now. And that's why we don't have the same depth of research that we do in the more widely held companies.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. Such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for another perspective on that really big story this week, I'm now being joined by a well-known market analyst, Hemendra Hazari. Hemendra, thank you so much for joining us on this program. Just wanted to understand, we can discuss what's happening on the fundamentals of the Adani Group and where that's going and what that means for India. But first of all, the stock market crash that we have seen in Adani Group's shares. Do you think it's gone on long enough? Many stocks are still locked on down circuit, like Total Gas and Transmission Power. One or two of them are still on downward circuit. Adani Enterprises has seen a lot of volatility. It was down 25-30%, bounced all the way back up. What do you think is going to happen to the stock prices here?
One must bear in mind that the increase in the Adani Group share prices in the last 2 years has been spectacular.
Yeah.
On average, I think they've increased by about 819%. So if one assumes that the normal price was before it started its rise, then we really don't know where the bottom and where the normalized price range could be. Because it has to be remembered that the Adani Group, which are listed, they have very limited floating stock. indeed, one of the objectives of the follow-on public issue was to broaden the investor base and to get retail investors in. So when the rise has been so spectacular, the fall can also be equally spectacular. So that is what has to be considered by investors before they take a decision whether to buy or to sell the stocks.
I think you're making a very important point, Mr. Hazari, and I just want to make sure I understand that. We were referring to that a little earlier as well. When there's a small float, when there's a thin float, it is possible you can have stock prices jumping up 8 times, 10 times, 20 times, and we have seen that in Adani Group's shares in the last 2 years. That same thin float means that you could be having this sort of a 50-60% drop in a very short period of time because, there's not enough float in the market. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Correct. But one has to see that in this decline that we are seeing currently, that the volumes are massive. See, because earlier the volumes when it was rising were not so massive. Now there is a lot of, whether it must be speculator interest, but it is coming down with very heavy volumes. So it tells you that there is a genuine push there to push the share prices down.
It's often said that whatever happens at a stock market is not often connected with the actual, how the companies are positioned and how well they're running their businesses and how solid the businesses are. Stock prices can gyrate out of sync with that. Do you think the companies themselves could come under stress right now, repaying loans, raising more money? Does all of that get affected by a stock market crisis if it's a purely stock market crisis?
Most definitely, yes. Because when the stock prices was going up spectacularly, there was really no fundamental reason why these stocks were going up. But because of the Hindenburg report, there are justifiable concerns, and the Hindenburg report is very specific. It is backed by and supported by documentation. So today there are significant concerns which can cause the share price to come down because there are corporate governance concerns, there are fundamental concerns. And when the share prices and the bond prices collapse like the way they are, that means for these companies, the capital market doors have been slammed shut and they need liquidity to manage their day-to-day operations, as well as to manage and to fund their huge capital expenditure plans. In my view, all this will have to be curtailed because today only the Indian government banks can handhold the company when they need liquidity. Also, there is a lot of concern that if these Indian government banks increase their exposures, their own bank shares will start collapsing. So therefore, it is absolutely important that Adani Group now consolidate, they give up on their major capex plans, and they may even start considering divesting their assets. Because today for them, liquidity takes precedence over growth.
All right, Mr. Hemendra Hazari, thank you so much for joining us with that perspective. Thanks a lot. Our next story is from Pakistan. The country was in the news once again this week and once again for all the wrong reasons, this time because of a suicide bomb attack and, of course, the continuing movement of Pakistan towards imminent bankruptcy, with the IMF having all sorts of questions. But I'll come to that in a little while later. Let's just return to the terror attack. A suicide bomber blew himself up inside a mosque in Pakistan. It happened in Peshawar. The afternoon prayers were on. There were more than 250 people inside the mosque when the bomber, seated on the front row of the mosque, decided to detonate his vest. A wall collapsed and fell on worshippers. The roof caved in. What happened next? Well, let's listen to some of the people who were inside the mosque.
As soon as we raised hands to say Allahu Akbar, suddenly a loud blast occurred. A huge flame came to my face and it pushed me away. I lost consciousness for 2-3 minutes. I was in the prayer hall. After I regained consciousness, after 2-3 minutes, I found myself under the rubble.
I became unconscious after the blast. After 2-3 minutes, when I regained consciousness, the roof was on top of me. I was as if glued to the ground. Allah opened a hole for me to get out. I saw the people in really bad condition in front of me.
At least 100 people died in the blast. Among them was an imam. 150 others were injured. It was the decade's deadliest blast for Pakistan. The police believe that at least 12 kilograms of explosives were used. The question being asked is whether the blast was the result of an intelligence failure. How did the attacker enter the mosque? He was apparently wearing a police uniform, but this mosque is also located inside a police compound. And reports say that the police are not ruling out inside help. We've seen protests. We've seen some unprecedented protests by the police after this entire attack. Now, it is being said by some that people in positions of power may have helped the suicide bomber. Several suspects have already been nabbed. Their identity, though, has still not been revealed. The next question, who orchestrated the blast? The answer really depends on whom you ask. In the hours following the blast, a couple of members of the Tehreek-e-Taliban or TTP said the blast was revenge for what? The death of TTP leader Khalid Khorasani. Does that mean that the TTP planned and carried out this blast? The terror group's main spokesperson, however, says no. So then who's behind the blast? The last time there was a blast inside a mosque in Pakistan, the IS or the Islamic State had claimed responsibility. That was way back in August 2022. 67 people had died back then. Then as well, it was a mosque in Peshawar. But it's important to note that a lot has changed between then and now. Today, the situation in Pakistan has become absolutely desperate. There's a massive economic crisis. Consumer prices are up 27.5% year on year. 27.5%. The country is running out of food. Electricity and foreign reserves are also, well, the electricity has been off for a long time. Foreign exchange reserves down to just $3 billion or thereabouts. Reports say that Pakistan is left with just enough money to pay for 3 weeks of imports. That's the level of foreign exchange reserves. What happens after that? There's really no answer to this question. We have a real situation where a country like Pakistan, a nuclear weapons power, one of the larger countries in the world, could actually be facing bankruptcy in just a couple of weeks from now. There's an argument taking place constantly between the IMF and Pakistan. The IMF says whatever it is that Pakistan is promising is not enough. It's not credible. We need to see more. We need to see the assets of senior bureaucrats. Now, Pakistan has taken some steps. It's devalued its currency, for example. It's devalued its currency by 15%. But is it going to be enough? Is it going to be enough to get that bailout which Pakistan so desperately needed? The IMF is there and playing hardball. The IMF has also said that Pakistan is going to grow by just 2% this year, which is opposed to the 3.5% that was earlier being expected. And now, in the middle of all of this, there's terrorism back again. Yes, I know everyone can look and say Pakistan has only itself to blame. You're going to encourage terrorism for decade after decade. You're going to use it as a weapon of state policy against both your neighbors. You used it against India. You used it against Afghanistan. At some point, it is going to come back to haunt you. And that's frankly a valid point. Because let's take a look at what happens now. What does a terror attack in the middle of a financial crisis mean for Pakistan? What do speculations of an insider hand mean for a country that is actually counting on an international bailout right now? The FATF, or the Financial Action Task Force, is surely watching these developments very closely. So, of course, is the rest of the world. So is neighbor India. New Delhi has been in the know of the deteriorating situation in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa ever since the Taliban came to power in Kabul. India has been warning about it. India has been saying if the Taliban takes over, it's not necessarily going to be good news for anyone, perhaps not even for Pakistan. And again, those are chickens that are now coming home to roost. We've seen the situation in Pakistan go from bad to worse ever since the Taliban came. We've been seeing provinces near Afghanistan becoming a revolving door for terrorism. The TTP, for example, has regrouped now. The terror group has tightened its hold over certain regions. It's even declared a parallel government. It is an understatement to say that Pakistan is a security threat for the region. We've known that for a long time. But frankly, this entire situation is now a security threat and an existential threat for Pakistan itself. Is realization finally going to dawn at some point on policymakers in Pakistan that a course correction is required? And if that realization comes, is it too late? Because let's face it, the present economic situation in Pakistan and the Peshawar blast. These are rude reminders to the world, which doesn't really need too much reminding, that the Pakistani security situation has become as desperate as its economic situation. And it's a moot point as to which of them is worse. To discuss this story, I'm now being joined by Lisa Curtis. She's a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNAS. She's also worked as a senior advisor in the South Asian Bureau of the U.S. State Department. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. Just wanted to get your sense of what's happening in Pakistan. It seems to be a rather grim situation, of course, on the economic front. And then there's this terror attack, which brings back memories of a equally dark time for Pakistan when terror really seemed to be ruling and the TTP was all over the place.
Yes, Pakistan is facing multiple crises right now. One in terms of the economy, which they're seeing, falling foreign exchange reserves. They're at risk of defaulting. They're trying to negotiate an IMF bailout, but they'll need to take the hard steps that the IMF is demanding in terms of cutting subsidies, raising taxes. So, the question is, will Pakistan finally bite the bullet and take some of these steps that the IMF has been demanding so that they can avoid a default, much like we saw in Sri Lanka? We don't want Pakistan to go the way that Sri Lanka went last year. So they're facing these economic challenges. At the same time, there's been this major horrible terrorist attack in Peshawar that was conducted on a police base at a mosque. And most of the victims, perhaps as many as 100 victims, were police officers, government employees. And this is a terrible attack. I think the Pakistan government believes it was conducted by the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, which has been escalating its attacks inside Pakistan ever since the Taliban took control of Afghanistan next door. So I think, the question is, are we seeing Pakistan return to the state that we saw 10 years ago when we saw almost weekly attacks by the TTP? And, how can we ensure that Pakistan remains stable and is able to thwart this growing threat from the TTP?
All right, Lisa, let's just look at each of those 2 points in some detail. Let's just remember what Hillary Clinton said not that long back. If you keep snakes in your backyard, then you can't be surprised if those snakes are going to bite you at some point. There are many who will say what's happening in Pakistan is exactly that. Your chickens are coming home to roost. Pakistan has encouraged terrorism and backed the Taliban for year after year, for decade after decade, and now Pakistan is paying the price for those faulty policies.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. Look, many of us warned that there would be blowback from a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, that the impact wouldn't just be devastating for the people of Afghanistan, which we're certainly seeing with the rollback of women's rights, the closing of universities to women, just horrible things happening to the Afghan people inside Afghanistan. But the blowback is reaching out into the region and perhaps, beyond, because that is, the fact is other jihadist organizations are inspired by the Taliban's ability to take control of Afghanistan. They see it as the Taliban were victorious against the U.S. and all the NATO countries. And so they feel the wind is at their back. And I think that's what we are seeing. The TTP is inspired, and the Taliban isn't cracking down on the TTP bases inside Afghanistan. I think, maybe Pakistan assumed that they would get cooperation from the Taliban, since they, of course, had provided safe haven to the Taliban for the 20 years that the U.S. was fighting in Afghanistan. But apparently that doesn't seem to be the case. But I think you're right. Many of us had warned about this blowback, but we're now, really seeing it play out.
Well, again, as I said, a lot of people did think it was a matter of time that encouragement of terror is going to sometimes come back and bite Pakistan itself. Now, there's an interesting question which arises from that when it comes to India. There have been some noises from inside Pakistan almost indicating that it is time for peace with India. Let's try and have a rapprochement. We are hemmed in from all sides. It's not that peace overtures or noises have not been made in the past, but this time, given how desperate the situation is for Pakistan, do you expect that Pakistan will actually try and reach out and say, let's try and have some sort of a settlement with India because we're desperate. We can't afford to be in this situation anymore. We're surrounded from all sides.
Well, I think an effort to, build peace talks or, at least start with, some kind of peace gesture would certainly be in Pakistan's interest. And we have seen this current government led by Shehbaz Sharif. We've seen the PMLN extend a hand of friendship to India in the past. We have seen their interest in having better relations between Pakistan and India. And of course, the foreign minister, Bilawal Bhutto, part of the PPP, has also often reached out for peace talks with India in the past. So this would not be something unexpected from the current government. And I also think it would be in India's interest to try to build some kind of rapport with Pakistan that could perhaps eventually lead to more peaceful, normal relations between India and Pakistan. It's not going to be easy. It won't happen overnight. But, India faces pressure from China on its line of actual control with China. We saw the clashes in 2020 at Galwan. We saw a recent clash. Fortunately, it didn't result in deaths, but we did see a border clash near Tawang in India's state of Arunachal Pradesh. So it would be in India's interest to not have to deal with a tense border situation with both of its neighbors, China on one side, Pakistan on the other. So it would certainly be in India's interest as well to try to pursue some kind of normalization with Pakistan.
Well, I have to say, Lisa, it's not necessarily a government that's going to be, particularly adopting a softer approach to Pakistan, although it can be said that because this is a tough government and a hardline government, it can reach out to Pakistan just as Nixon did with China. But at least the immediate response from India has not been particularly conciliatory. There's now talk about renegotiating the Indus Water Treaty, for example, and a very clear stance from India saying, if Pakistan really wants to have any friendship, you have got to stop encouraging terrorism. Do it for our sake, do it for your own sake.
Well, I think that's right. I think that the current Modi government, does not seem particularly interested in sticking its neck out for a peace process. And of course, Prime Minister Modi and previous Indian governments have been burned in the past when they have tried to reach out to Pakistan, and then a terrorist attack happens in India shortly thereafter. So they will be cautious, and I think that the onus is on Pakistan. If Pakistan really wants to pursue some kind of normalization, they'll have to make the first move because India has been burned too many times by Pakistan on this front. So they would really need to see some sincerity of purpose from all parts of the Pakistan government, because let's remember, the military has traditionally been in control of the policies related to India, nuclear weapons, Kashmir, Afghanistan, all of those important issues. So India would need to see commitment from not only the civil leadership, but also the military leadership.
But Lisa, I think it has to be said that while Pakistan is in a desperate situation and it needs to have peace with India, in India, the priority isn't quite that high. The focus is more on China. Pakistan's sort of gone off the radar. It's a small country. It's an irritant. The Indian economy cannot compare. Pakistan doesn't loom that high in Indian policymakers' thinking anymore. So therefore, the desire to go out and do something dramatic to have peace to Pakistan is not really there anymore, not in India.
Yeah, well, again, I think that comes back to the point that the onus would be on Pakistan. Pakistan would have to decide this is something that it really wants. It's willing to go the extra mile to try to seek some kind of normalization with India. And I also might point out, this would help with Pakistan's relationship with the United States, because we see that Pakistan doesn't want to be wholly reliant on China. They've seen the drawbacks of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. This is part of the reason that their economy is doing so badly, because they have over-relied on China for project assistance. So I think if Pakistan makes a sincere attempt to try to normalize relations with India, this will go a long way toward improving U.S.-Pakistan relations, which I think is something of interest to Pakistani leaders, so that they don't have as their only option China.
All right, Lisa, last question. You know, the economic situation is desperate. Pakistan's asking for a bailout. Now, a lot of people, perhaps somewhat unkindly, are going to say that what Pakistan's strategy in dealing with these bankruptcy-type situations is, it says, we're a nuclear power, we've got nuclear missiles. Do you really want us to go under? Do you really want jihadists or extremists to have nuclear weapons? It's a sort of, you know, I'm going to have a gun to my own head, and if you don't help me, you know, the trigger can be pressed, and all of us could be affected because of that. So therefore, you've got to come out with a bailout package, and you've got to help us.
I don't think Pakistan has that option right now. The U.S. does not have troops inside Afghanistan. We don't rely on Pakistan to resupply troops through the overland routes to Afghanistan. So I don't see that Pakistan really has that kind of leverage. Yeah, nobody wants to see Pakistan blow up, but neither do Pakistanis and the Pakistani leadership. So I think that Pakistan has a lot less leverage with the United States now that the U.S. no longer has troops inside Afghanistan.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's move to our next story now, and I'm afraid the situation doesn't get much better. Let's move to West Asia, where there is, unfortunately, now talk of a third intifada. In other words, another rebellion or uprising. Let's just recap some of this week's events. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in West Asia. He met the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, also the President of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas. Blinken was not the first American official to recently land in Israel. The White House National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was in Israel earlier this month. So was the CIA Director, William Burns. So why are all these officials jetting off to West Asia? Because there's a crisis. There's rising violence, both in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. The Israeli Defense Forces are raiding refugee camps. Palestinian gunmen are firing inside synagogues. There are terrorist attacks that are taking place in synagogues, and people are dying. People are dying on both sides, but there's been a particularly brutal terror attack right now. All of this is bringing back the shadows of another intifada, another Palestinian uprising. Let's quickly recap some history, if we can, for you about the intifadas. The first intifada, or the first Palestinian uprising, began in 1987. This was after an Israeli Defense Force truck collided with a civilian car, resulting in the death of 4 Palestinians. Protests and civil disobedience then followed. They went on for months. They went on for years. Then these demonstrations turned violent more often than not. The first intifada lasted 5 years, killing nearly 2,000 people. The second intifada began in September 2000. This was after Ariel Sharon, the then Israeli opposition leader, made a visit to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The site is considered the third holiest in Islam, so Palestinians did not take this visit very lightly. Angry demonstrators gathered on the streets. The months that followed saw targeted killings, aerial attacks, suicide bombings, stone pelting, terror attacks, rocket attacks from both sides. The second intifada believed to have killed nearly 4,000 people. So, as you may have figured out, intifada, a period of uprising accompanied by high casualties, and that's not something that Israel wants, it's not something that the Middle East wants. Now, recent polls are showing that 61% of Palestinians and 65% of Israeli Jews think a third intifada is on the horizon. And that's bad news. Are they wrong? Has the cycle of violence already begun? And is the Israeli government doing everything it can to stop it, or is it in fact encouraging it? Now, following last week's spate of violence, Netanyahu's office announced a range of, quote, additional deterrent measures, unquote. What measures? Well, revoking Jerusalem residents' rights of families of militants, stripping their social security, stripping their health benefits. Earlier this week, we saw homes being bulldozed. Moreover, the Israeli government has now pledged to expedite gun permits for Israeli citizens, basically arm more Israelis. Many of these measures are actually considered illegal under international law. But the Israeli authorities right now don't sound as if they really care, because it's often being said by critics, the current Israeli cabinet is perhaps the most far-right ever. Many critics say it is actually a group of religious and ultra-nationalist politicians, and that could have its own impact. A member of the cabinet, Itamar Ben-Gvir, began this year by visiting the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Hamas called the move a red line. Analysts essentially are now fearing that all of these things that are happening, and the so-called deterrence, and of course the terror attack, let's not forget the terror attack that we've just seen, all of this could trigger an escalation in tension. And if that happens, it's not going to be good for anybody. And then, of course, you can have a blame game. You can say it's the Palestinian Authority to blame, or the Israeli government is to be blamed, but an escalation of violence is not going to be good news. And there are signs of this happening. Earlier this week, an exchange of fire between Israel and people in the Gaza Strip. Israeli aircraft struck a rocket production workshop in the Gaza Strip. This was after rockets were fired into Israel from Gaza. So a critical question at this point is, where does this escalation and the recent developments leave the two states solution? So let me put this to Frau Hassan Nahum, who's the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, and that's where she's joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us, and WION, ma'am. The last thing I think anybody would want is a third intifada or a rise in violence. How do you see the situation? Is there likely to be an escalation?
Well, we had a very, very difficult, tragic weekend last weekend where 8 innocent people were gunned down outside a place of worship, outside a synagogue, indiscriminately. The following day, as you know, we saw 2 innocent people who were walking around killed by a 13-year-old, gunned down on the street. Unfortunately, one of the victims looks like his situation is getting worse. And unfortunately, we see these flare-ups every now and again. I am an optimist by nature. I don't believe there's going to be a third intifada, because I believe that the Palestinian Authority is losing legitimacy amongst its own people. They're a government who hasn't provided anything, any basic thing to their people. Jobs, decent healthcare. They are autonomous in their regions, and yet they provide nothing. And so I don't think they have the credibility of the leadership right now to be able to coordinate a curated intifada against us. And of course, our security and our defense establishment is strong, and we have our finger on the pulse at every moment. So I would like to believe that this is not going to escalate, that unfortunately we have these flare-ups, and we have to continue being vigilant to quell the flare-ups of terrorism that we have now and again.
Yeah, I guess one of the biggest problems is there becomes a vicious cycle, and a cycle of blame and of accusations. We heard what you said. You'll hear people on the Palestinian Authority and the other side saying that, yes, it's a far-right government in Israel and they are the ones who are fanning the violence. That then leads to its own dynamics, and that's when violence can escalate.
You can't make a moral equivalence between rooting out terrorists when you know of an impending attack and gunning down innocent people on the street. There's no cycle here. What we have is, unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership, which has never really ideologically accepted that Israel exists. This doesn't come from any type of situation other than the fact that the Palestinians, and it doesn't matter with which government, people are talking about the government now. What was the problem with the government in the early 2000s that offered the Palestinian leadership everything they said they wanted? What was the problem with a left-wing government that came in a couple of years later that offered them even more of what they said they wanted? And what was the problem with successive governments that were not right? Some of them were even left. And we're still in the same situation. And the situation comes from one very clear reason, and that is the Palestinian leadership cannot say, have not ideologically or emotionally accepted that Israel is not going anywhere, that Israel is here to stay, and we have the legitimate right to be a country, a homeland for the Jewish people. That is the root of the problem. It's not about any type of cycle of violence. It's about acceptance.
Is there, as the solution is searched for, and a solution has been been hard to find, of course, for a very, very long period of time, how concerned are you as the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem that there could be another upsurge of terrorism, of violence, of once again, people having to look over their shoulders and worry about when the next suicide attack could come or the next bomb blast could come? What is your own expectation in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, we are actually one of the safest capital cities in the world. We have very low crime. And like I said earlier, we worry about flare-ups now and again of violent terrorist crime. But we are a secure city. We are connected to the security forces, to cameras. People here are vigilant. And ultimately, I don't think we're going to see return to suicide bombs, because I don't think people are stupid enough now to believe that killing themselves is going to bring any type of solution. And I think people have stopped believing their own leadership, that this is somehow leading to some type of solution.
All right, thank you so much for joining us for that. I'm going to be in Jerusalem in just a couple of weeks from now, so maybe we'll get a chance to come across and
we look forward to having you here.
Experiencing that for myself. Thank you so much for joining us on WION. Thank you. And that's This World This Week on WION. I'm Vikram Chandra. It's been a rather volatile week, from the stock markets in India to potential bankruptcy and a security crisis in Pakistan to, of course, whatever's happening in West Asia. We'll be back next week. Do remember to tune in.